The parents of a 13-year-old boy who died participating in a TikTok Benadryl.
Benadryl, a drug that most of us take to clear our allergies or help us go to sleep, but it can be a lot darker than that. The effects of high-dose Benadryl can be disturbing. Today, we're going to learn about them. Welcome to the Benadryl Iceberg. If you're new here, I do a lot of these DRUG icebergs, so if you want more of that or just more disturbing, scary content, be sure to subscribe. It means a lot to me. Also, follow my Instagram, join my Discord, let's hang out. And before we get into this, a disclaimer. I do not condone any recreational use of Benadryl. This video is purely informational and entertainment. Okay, let's get into this. Starting with, Benadryl works the best for my allergies. For many, Benadryl is the trusty first line of defense against allergies. Diphenhydramine, the active ingredient, works by blocking histamine, the chemical responsible for the body's allergic response. When you come into contact with pollen, pet dander, or dust, your immune system reacts, releasing histamine to fight off what it thinks is a threat. This causes inflammation and classic symptoms like sneezing, itchy eyes, and a runny nose. Benadryl steps in by blocking histamine receptors, helping to ease these symptoms quickly and often noticeably. Most people have heard of the drowsiness that Benadryl causes, but they may not know why it happens. While antihistamines relieve allergy symptoms, they also affect receptors in the brain, causing sedation. Benadryl is known as a first-generation antihistamine, meaning it easily crosses the blood-brain barrier, which is why it makes people sleepy. Newer, second-generation antihistamines like Claritin and Zyrtec don't cross that barrier so easily, so they cause less drowsiness. But many still swear by Benadryl for allergies because they feel it's simply more effective, even if it comes with a ticket to nap time. The easy availability of Benadryl and its wide use for something as common as allergies is why many people don't think about it twice. This perception of safety plays a major role in why some people underestimate its power, especially when it comes to larger doses or frequent use. It's considered one of the, quote, safest over-the-counter medications because of its everyday allergy relief role, setting up a stark contrast with the stories that unfold and the deeper layers of this iceberg, so stay tuned for that. Now, that was the only one in layer 1, so we're gonna get straight into layer 2, taking it to fall asleep. Benadryl's side effect of drowsiness has made it a popular, if unofficial, sleep aid. It's so commonly used for this that some doctors actually recommend it short-term when people struggle with insomnia. Also, I see some of those like Tylenol PMs that has like Tylenol in it and that is also supposed to put you to sleep, and it uses diphenhydramine as the sleep thing to put you to sleep. For people who only need help sleeping occasionally, it's a quick fix, but it's not without drawbacks. Regular use can lead to rebound insomnia, meaning that after stopping, people might find it even harder to sleep than before. I know I've done that, bro. I've taken one to fall asleep every night for like a week, and then I try to go to sleep again, and I just can't. There's also an unexpected phenomenon associated with prolonged Benadryl use: tolerance. Over time, the body adapts to the drug, and people find that they may need higher doses to get the same sedative effect. However, larger doses also increase the risk of unwanted side effects, from dry mouth and blurred vision to more severe reactions like confusion or even hallucinations. Taking Benadryl regularly for sleep might seem harmless, but it can spiral into dependence, a key transition point for people who eventually start using it recreationally, where the effects shift from benign to bizarre. Next up, we got the TikTok Benadryl Challenge. The TikTok Benadryl Challenge became a disturbing social media trend in 2020, urging young people to take large doses of Benadryl to experience hallucinations. The trend started as part of TikTok's viral challenge culture, where users try risky stunts for likes and views, but the consequences of this challenge were pretty severe, with emergency room visits skyrocketing and reports of overdoses and even deaths. This challenge centered on achieving hallucinations, an unusual but well-known effect of diphenhydramine when taken in high doses. People in these videos would often describe seeing shadowy figures, hearing voices, or experiencing other disturbing, often frightening visual and auditory hallucinations. Unlike recreational psychedelics, which produce colorful or vivid visions, Benadryl's effects tend to be dark, shadowy, and uncomfortable. Many people report seeing things like spiders crawling on the walls, faceless people, or bizarre scenes that seem both real and deeply unsettling. While some tried this out of curiosity, many believed it was relatively safe, simply because Benadryl is sold over the counter. However, what most participants didn't realize is that high doses of diphenhydramine push the body far beyond its safe limits, leading to a type of intoxication known as anticholinergic delirium. At such levels, the brain becomes overwhelmed and the drug's side effects multiply. Users can experience rapid heart rate, seizures, severe dehydration, confusion, and even coma. The actual mechanics of the hallucinations are unique to Benadryl's chemical structure. As an anticholinergic, it disrupts neurotransmitters responsible for things like memory and attention, making the brain struggle to differentiate between reality and hallucination. This often leads to delirium, a state where people feel utterly detached from the real world and can have little control over their actions or thoughts. And for many people, this state is not enjoyable, and rather it can be terrifying, with memories of the experience often patchy or vague afterward. The challenge quickly caught public attention as hospitals started reporting cases of teens brought in with serious symptoms following the challenge. In some tragic cases, the challenge proved fatal. One pretty highly publicized case involved a 15-year-old from Oklahoma who died after attempting the challenge with some friends. Stories like this have led to a major public backlash, with healthcare professionals warning against the dangers of high-dose Benadryl and anticholinergic overdose. They highlighted that Benadryl isn't a quote-unquote safe way to hallucinate, and instead it's highly toxic when used this way. TikTok reacted by banning all videos encouraging or referencing the Benadryl challenge, removing content and restricting hashtags related to it. They also set new guidelines to limit access to dangerous content. Despite these efforts, the trend exposed an underlying problem. Many young people have little understanding of over-the-counter drugs risks, often seeing them as low risk simply because they're available in drugstores. And that is the end of layer 2, so let's get into layer 3, starting with FAP dose. The term FAP dose it's exactly what it sounds like. It refers to a strange subculture around recreational Benadryl use, specifically when it's taken to enhance or change sensations during solo sexual activities. It's part of a broader phenomenon where people experiment with medications not for medical or hallucinogenic purposes, but to alter physical or psychological experiences in unconventional ways. The FAP dose concept generally involves taking smaller amounts of Benadryl, enough to feel sedated or experience mild euphoria, without reaching the intense hallucinations seen at high doses. Users claim this dose heightens sensations and relaxations, creating a unique, albeit risky, experience. The effects of diphenhydramine at lower doses typically include mild drowsiness, reduced inhibitions, and even slight physical numbness. In small amounts, people report feeling pleasantly sedated or relaxed, finding that it enhances focus on physical sensations while numbing other thoughts. This, combined with the feeling of inhibition release, can lead to an altered experience during intimate moments, leading users to call it the FAP dose. However, it's important to note that even these lower doses can carry risks. Diphenhydramine sedative properties can impair coordination and response time, creating a sense of physical detachment that can become disorienting. Over time, individuals who experiment with these doses may develop tolerance, finding that they need larger amounts to achieve the same effects. As the dose increases, so do the risks, including the possibility of hallucinations or other anticholinergic symptoms. Stories on online forums like Reddit describe people who unintentionally slipped into uncomfortable, quote, mini trips, experiencing distorted visuals, audio hallucinations, or even eerie sensations of being watched. Alright, next up we got a good one. This is, an interesting one. We got mixing DPH with DXM. Mixing DPH, or diphenhydramine, with DXM, or dextromethorphan, is one of the most complex and potentially dangerous practices in recreational drug use. Both substances are over-the-counter medications that, when taken in high doses, can produce intense psychoactive effects. DPH, as we discussed, is a first-generation antihistamine with potent anticholinergic properties, meaning it blocks acetylcholine in the brain and can cause hallucinations, delirium, and severe cognitive effects. DXM, on the other hand, is commonly found in cough suppressants like Robitussin and functions as a dissociative at high doses, affecting the brain's NMDA receptors and creating effects similar to PCP or ketamine. And when combined, these two drugs create a mixture of hallucinatory and dissociative effects that are often unpredictable, intense, and hazardous. So to understand the impact of mixing DPH and DXM, it's helpful to look at how each drug affects the brain on its own. DPH primarily impacts acetylcholine, creating an anticholinergic fog that affects memory, attention, and physical coordination. Hallucinations tend to be tactile and visual, with users reporting interactions with shadowy figures, animals, or even entities that appear lifelike, as I talked about earlier when we were talking about the TikTok Benadryl challenge. DXM, meanwhile, operates by blocking NMDA receptors, leading to an experience known as dissociation, where users feel detached from their body or the physical world. High doses of DXM are associated with plateaus or levels of dissociation that range from mild euphoria, first plat, to full out-of-body experiences, or the fourth plateau. When combined, the effects are layered, creating both an anticholinergic haze and a dissociative state that users describe as intensely surreal, disturbing, or outright terrifying. In fact, the effects don't simply add up, they amplify each other. While DXM alone can lead to dissociative experiences, the addition of DPH brings hallucinations that feel unusually real, blurring the line between what's imagined and what's actually physically felt. It's common for users to feel like they're floating outside their bodies, while simultaneously interacting with lifelike, often frightening hallucinations, such as spiders, figures in the dark, or ominous shadowy beings. The combined cognitive load of DPH and DXM can be mentally exhausting, even traumatic, due to the unpredictable hallucinations and sensory distortions. As mentioned, DPH produces a delirious, confused state, and DXM's dissociation can make users feel emotionally numb or detached, creating a bizarre state where users are hallucinating but they feel powerless to react to it. This combination is infamous for its entities, or visitors, that users frequently report seeing, feeling that they're in the presence of otherworldly beings who seem to communicate with them or observe them. In online forums, some people describe these encounters as profoundly unsettling, with an almost evil or foreboding presence, an experience far from the colorful hallucinations associated with traditional psychedelics. Physically, mixing DPH and DXM presents numerous dangers. DPH raises the heart rate and can cause issues like dry mouth, urinary retention, and confusion. DXM in high doses also stresses the cardiovascular system, leading to symptoms like hypertension and, in extreme cases, seizures. Combined, they place an enormous strain on the body's systems, particularly the heart and kidneys. This combination is known to create, quote, serotonin syndrome in some cases, which is a potentially fatal condition marked by high fever, rapid heartbeat, sweating, and muscle rigidity. Serotonin syndrome occurs when too much serotonin accumulates in the brain, which can happen with DXM, especially if combined with other medications or substances that impact serotonin. Another layer of complexity is that both DPH and DXM can lead to rapid tolerance buildup. Tolerance occurs when the body adjusts to the presence of a substance requiring higher doses to achieve the same effects. With regular or even semi-regular use, people who mix DPH and DXM may find that they need increasingly higher and larger doses to experience the desired effects. This raises the risk of dangerous side effects or overdose, especially as the line between a trip dose and a toxic dose can be incredibly thin with both substances. Long-term use of DPH is linked to cognitive issues, including memory loss and difficulty concentrating. These cognitive effects can become semi-permanent, particularly in cases where people use DPH frequently. DXM, meanwhile, is associated with Olney's lesions, a phenomenon observed in animals where high doses of dissociatives can cause brain lesions. While human studies are less definitive, the risk of cognitive impairment is a serious concern. People who use this combination long-term sometimes report lasting effects, flashbacks, disorientation, or even hallucinations during sober periods. Stories from people who combine DPH and DXM reveal the intense and often harrowing experiences involved. In one frequently shared story from an online forum, a user described seeing shadow people who seemed to speak in riddles, walking through the user's home with a feeling of impending doom. The combination of feeling physically numb from DXM while being mentally tormented by DPH-induced hallucinations made it feel like they were, quote, trapped in a nightmare. And then another user recounted a trip where they believed they had died and they were floating as a ghost in their own home, unable to interact with the real world, hearing disembodied voices mocking them. In one tragic case, a young man in his early 20s experienced kidney failure after frequently mixing DPH and DXM. He described the experience as a constant search for a, quote, better trip, but as his tolerance grew, he began pushing his doses higher and higher, eventually leading to hospitalization. His kidneys were so damaged that he required dialysis. a painful reminder of the physical toll that this mixture can take. Another well-known case involved a user who claimed to have experienced ego death, a term commonly associated with intense psychedelic experiences where one's sense of self dissolves. This user described feeling as though they were nobody, watching from a distance as their own body went through motions that they couldn't control. Afterward, they experienced lasting psychological effects, including anxiety, panic attacks, and feelings of dissociation, even in sober states. This phenomenon shows that while DPH and DXM don't have the classic reputation of substances like LSD or psilocybin, their combined effects can still reach deeply into a person's psyche, leading to lasting and often troubling impacts. Now, to be fair, you can experience ego death on just DXM in high doses, but DPH makes it easier. In online forums, experienced users of DPH and DXM almost universally discourage newcomers from mixing the two. Many who have tried it describe the experience as horrific or psychologically scarring, warning others that it's far from a, enjoyable high. Some go as far as to describe it as a form of self-torture, where users voluntarily enter a state of paranoia, confusion, and hallucination that they can't escape from. Okay, next up, I'm just gonna breeze right through. This iceberg just has calling it DPH, which is just like the shortened version of diphenhydramine, so that's not really important to talk about. Our next up, we got light recreational use. While high-dose Benadryl use often leads to intense and disorienting experiences, there's a portion of users who experiment with what they call light recreational use. This refers to taking smaller doses than what would be necessary for a full trip, but enough to feel slightly sedated, mildly euphoric, or somewhat detached. These smaller doses, usually around 50 to 100 milligrams depending on the individual's tolerance, produce similar effects as to what I mentioned in the FAP dose entry. Mild relaxation, a slightly numbing sensation, and a calming, but sometimes foggy headspace. The term light here is relative. These smaller doses can still cause side effects like drowsiness, dry mouth, and slight confusion, and as people become more familiar with this level of use, some may begin increasing their dosage to intensify the effects. It's a subtle step into deeper territory, as the body quickly builds a tolerance to the drug. Users find that they need progressively higher amounts to reach the same calming state, leading to a pretty slippery slope. As I mentioned earlier, tolerance can build up quickly with diphenhydramine, so what starts as light recreational use may turn into higher doses with more risk. People who engage in light recreational use are often seeking an easy way to just take the edge off after a long day, or to relax without resorting to alcohol or other substances. For some, it's a way to reduce anxiety or unwind, as the sedation that Benadryl provides can feel grounding and soothing. Some users even claim it helps them feel less inhibited, providing a gentle buzz or a feeling of detachment from daily stressors. However, because Benadryl isn't designed to induce euphoria, the effects are subtle and users often feel slightly foggy, drowsy sensation rather than the clarity or alertness that's associated with other recreational drugs. Interestingly, light doses of Benadryl also reflect a kind of experimentation often seen with OTC drugs, where users explore effects they might otherwise dismiss due to the drug's everyday reputation. As we've seen with entries like the TikTok Benadryl challenge, this exploration can sometimes spiral into risky behavior. Even with light recreational use, prolonged or frequent consumption can lead to dependency. Some users report feeling psychologically attached to the sense of calm that Benadryl provides and may struggle to stop, even at lower doses. Now, as I touched on earlier, even lower doses of Benadryl can come with some notable risks. Regular use of any amount can lead to anticholinergic syndrome, where cognitive issues like memory fog, trouble concentrating, and confusion can become part of daily life. This syndrome is especially relevant for people who dabble in light recreational use over long periods, as their brains adjust to regular dips in acetylcholine levels. Additionally, individuals who start with light use may find it leads to greater experimentation, and without intending to, they can progress towards more intense doses or combinations, as seen with DPH and DXM mixes. One frequent warning among seasoned users is that while the effects of light recreational use seem mild, the physical and cognitive impacts can accumulate over time. People often find themselves struggling with lingering fatigue, mental fog, or even emotional blunting, where they feel less connected to their surroundings. It's a small but real caution against the idea of safe or light Benadryl use, highlighting how even minor doses can subtly but significantly affect the mind and body over time. Next up, we got, this drug sucks. One of the more casual entries in this Benadryl Iceberg is the sentiment often expressed by some users who say, this drug sucks. For many people, Benadryl isn't exactly thrilling. It's sedating, it can make you feel groggy, and it doesn't produce the kind of euphoria or high that other recreational substances might. This reaction is especially common among those who've tried only small doses or who simply just don't respond to diphenhydramine in a way that feels pleasant or interesting. Diphenhydramine, the main ingredient in Benadryl, isn't like traditional recreational drugs that trigger the brain's reward pathways, producing feelings of happiness or excitement. Instead, it works as an antihistamine and a central nervous system depressant, primarily affecting histamine and acetylcholine receptors in the brain. This action tends to produce drowsiness, dry mouth, and a fuzzy headspace rather than anything exciting or euphoric, which can leave first-time experimenters feeling underwhelmed. People who try it expecting a light buzz or an enjoyable experience often end up disappointed, reporting instead a heavy, lethargic feeling. For users who are familiar with substances like cannabis, alcohol, or even prescription sedatives, Benadryl's effects can seem lackluster. While some might enjoy its sedative qualities, it lacks the mood-enhancing or stimulating aspects associated with many recreational drugs. Instead of feeling euphoric or uplifted, people often describe the effects as boring or unpleasantly tiring. In fact, this drug is notorious for causing what's known as an anticholinergic haze, where people feel mentally foggy, slow, and a bit disconnected rather than relaxed or happy. And as I mentioned earlier, this effect can be amplified with higher doses, leading to delirium and hallucinations rather than any sense of clarity. So yeah, people don't like Benadryl sometimes because it's not as cool or good feeling as fucking fentanyl. Next up we got r/DPH. r/DPH is a subreddit where people dive deep into all things related to diphenhydramine, especially its recreational use. It's a spot where users swap advice, talk about different doses, and share their personal experiences with DPH, often in a mix of fascination and caution. New users come here to learn what they're in for and find tips on keeping things safe, while seasoned members give real talk on the dangers that come with pushing doses or combining DPH with other drugs. One big thing on this subreddit is that a lot of users share their experiences, known as trip reports. These are detailed breakdowns of what people see, feel, and go through on different doses of DPH. You'll see posts describing eerie hallucinations like shadowy figures lurking around or full-on conversations with people who aren't really there. Many of these stories end up being cautionary tales, showing how quickly a Benadryl trip can turn dark and intense, even for people who thought they could handle it. These trip reports give a pretty raw look at what it's like to take high doses, and a lot of people post them to warn others or just to process what they went through. And then another defining aspect of r/DPH is that it's devoted to making sure newcomers don't hurt themselves using DPH. Users here are quick to point out the risks from dehydration and heart problems to full-on hallucinations that can leave you shaken. Harm reduction is huge here. People often share guidelines like always have a sober sitter, stay hydrated, and don't mix it with other substances. Since DPH is an anticholinergic, regulars remind people that using it too often can lead to long-term issues like memory fog, confusion, and difficulty focusing. This subreddit might be a place to talk about its recreational use, but it's just as much about making sure people stay safe too. And then also there are a lot of posts on here from people who have quit DPH and now deal with the long-term impacts. You'll see folks talking about memory problems, weird flashbacks, and that anticholinergic fog that makes daily life harder. Some users share how they got dependent on DPH, needing it just to feel normal, and how tough it was to break that habit. There's also a sense of regret in these posts, with many saying this drug isn't worth it. These recovery stories add a sobering layer to the subreddit, showing that for some, DPH use doesn't end at a single trip. It can kind of stick with you in a lot of ways that you didn't expect. And that's the end of layer 3. Let's get straight into layer 4. So the first one on this layer is r/DPH Anonymous. r/DPH Anonymous is another subreddit dedicated to DPH, but it's more of a support group than an exploration space. This community focuses on helping people quit DPH or manage their addiction, as opposed to sharing trip reports or encouraging recreational use. It's a space where people open up about the toll that DPH has taken on their lives and look for support to stop using it. One of the biggest parts of r/DPH Anonymous is the sense of accountability. Members post about their journey to quit or reduce their DPH use, updating the community on milestones, struggles, and relapses. It's common to see posts titled Day 1 or 90 Days Clean, with users sharing how they feel mentally and physically as they move away from DPH. The community offers encouragement, practical tips, and resources to help users stick with their goal of quitting. For For people who have tried and failed to quit on their own, this space can be a lifeline, showing them that they're not alone in this struggle. A lot of what gets discussed on r/DPH Anonymous are the long-term impacts that don't just disappear after stopping the drug. Many members talk about lingering issues like memory problems, mental fog, and anxiety, even months or years after quitting. The community dives into these topics as a way to process their experiences and remind others of the risks, especially since these effects are often overlooked in discussions around recreational use. People here talk about the reality of what it's like to live with these symptoms, which adds a layer of honesty and support that can be hard to find elsewhere. The subreddit also emphasizes strategies for avoiding relapse. Members discuss their triggers, situations or emotions that make them want to use DPH again, and share techniques to deal with cravings. Some turn to hobbies, mindfulness, or therapy, while others find that talking through their urges in the subreddit helps keep them grounded. There's a strong focus on harm reduction, even within the recovery process, as members help each other find healthier ways to cope with stress, anxiety, or insomnia without reaching for the Benadryl bottle. Alright, next we got average recreational use. Average recreational use of Benadryl typically involves doses that are higher than what people take for allergies or sleep, but still lower than what's used for intense hallucinogenic trips. Most users experimenting with average doses of Benadryl take somewhere between 150 to 300 milligrams, though even this range can vary depending on the person's tolerance. At this level, users report feeling mildly altered with effects like drowsiness, a detached or dreamy headspace, and sometimes slight visual distortions. At an average recreational dose, users usually don't reach the extreme hallucinations associated with higher doses. Instead, people tend to feel a heavy, sedated sensation and experience what some describe as a fog over their mind. It's common to feel slowed down, both physically and mentally, and things can start to feel a bit surreal or distorted. Many users describe this as a numbing effect, where emotions, thoughts, and physical sensations can be blunted, almost like the world is at arm's length. There's also a slightly euphoric quality for some, though it's subtle and it can be unpredictable. For certain people, this dose produces a sense of calm or an escape from anxiety, while for others, the mental dullness feels like too much, bringing on a disorienting, almost unpleasant sensation instead. The side effects that Benadryl is notorious for, like dry mouth and dizziness, tend to be more prominent here and can add to the overall strange, slightly uncomfortable nature of the experience. The appeal of average recreational use usually comes from the combination of sedation and mental numbness, as users may be looking for a way to disconnect or unwind without intense effects. It's an entry point for those curious about experimenting but who don't want to experience full-blown hallucinations or delusions. However, as I mentioned earlier, tolerance builds quickly with Benadryl, and people often find that they need more to achieve the same effects over time, which can easily lead them to higher doses. Also, just disclaimer, again, I'm not advocating any kind of Benadryl use that's not what's on the bottle. Just gotta say that officially, I'm not advocating this, There's also a risk of cognitive impairment, even at average recreational doses. Some people report having trouble with focus and memory after using Benadryl in this way, especially if they use it semi-regularly. It might not be as intense as what's seen at higher doses, but prolonged average use can still create that anticholinergic haze I mentioned, leading to persistent issues like brain fog and forgetfulness. For many users, average recreational use is a tipping point. It's where people often decide whether Benadryl is worth exploring further. Some stick with these doses and find that it's enough to satisfy their curiosity, while the others start experimenting with higher doses in search of more intense effects. In that sense, average recreational use can be seen as the midpoint of this Benadryl iceberg. It's an area where users often realize that even moderate experimentation comes with a unique set of risks and experiences. Alright, next up we have psychosis. Psychosis in general is a mental health condition where an individual loses contact with reality. This break from reality means that a person may have trouble distinguishing what's real from what's not. It's often characterized by hallucinations, seeing or hearing things that aren't there, and delusions, strong beliefs that aren't based in reality, and can also include disorganized thinking or speech. Psychosis isn't a standalone condition, but a symptom of several mental health disorders, like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or severe depression. It can also be triggered by substances like drugs or alcohol. Psychosis typically results from an imbalance in neurotransmitters, the brain's chemical messengers. In most cases, it involves an overactivity of dopamine, a neurotransmitter that plays a key role in how we perceive the world around us. When dopamine levels spike in certain areas of the brain, it can distort perceptions, causing people to misinterpret things, hear voices, or see things that aren't there. This is why psychosis is common in people with schizophrenia and why drugs that influence dopamine, like amphetamines or stimulants, can trigger psychosis in some people. When we talk about Benadryl or DPH-induced psychosis, we're looking at a slightly different mechanism. Benadryl is an anticholinergic, meaning it blocks acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter, and this one is involved in memory, learning, and the regulation of consciousness. At high doses, this disruption can lead to confusion, memory loss, and vivid hallucinations, all of which are hallmark features of psychosis. The hallucinations caused by Benadryl are typically disturbing and they feel deeply embedded in reality, which is why DPH psychosis is often described as more terrifying than that caused by other substances. Psychosis can occur in both first-time high-dose users and in those who have built up a tolerance over time. For some, it only takes one single high dose of like 500 milligrams or more to start experiencing these effects. With each increase, the body and brain reach a point of overload, and the usual sedative and dissociative effects escalate to full-blown delusions and hallucinations that feel incredibly real. At this point, users commonly describe seeing entities, shadowy figures, or even talking to people who don't exist. Unlike the mild hallucinations people might experience at lower doses, these hallucinations are immersive and feel fully integrated into reality, making it difficult for users to distinguish hallucination from truth. What's particularly disturbing about Benadryl-induced psychosis is that it often includes paranoid and frightening elements. People in this state report feeling hunted, watched, or controlled by imaginary figures. They may see insects crawling on their skin, hear whispering voices, or feel trapped in a loop of unsettling, repetitive thoughts. This type of psychosis is different from the trip associated with psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin. It's disorienting and often deeply disturbing, with none of the vivid colors or euphoric introspection. Many users describe it as pure terror, feeling as though they're stuck in a nightmare. The stories from people who have reached psychosis-level experiences on Benadryl are unsettling, and they serve as a powerful warning. Some users describe seeing and interacting with people who weren't there, like family members or friends who seemed completely real, only to realize later they'd been hallucinating. One user shared that they believed they were being hunted by government agents, and they were experiencing a level of paranoia that genuinely felt like it was life or death. And they remembered hiding from these imagined pursuers, convinced that their life was in danger, only to come down hours later and realize that none of it was real. Another case involved a person who, during a psychotic episode, wandered around their house for hours, seeing spiders crawling all over the walls and hearing voices urging them to hurt themselves. These episodes are often accompanied by a total loss of control, where people can't remember what they're doing or why, acting out of intense fear or confusion. Unlike other drugs that induce psychosis, Benadryl's effects leave users feeling fragmented, unable to anchor themselves in reality, which can be terrifying for first-time users who expected something less intense. Next up, we got DPH addiction. DPH addiction develops subtly, often catching users off guard because it doesn't create the same kind of physical dependency associated with drugs like opioids. Instead, it's primarily a psychological addiction fueled by a mix of tolerance, habit, and mental reliance. People often start using DPH at low doses for insomnia or mild recreational effects, and then over time, though, the body builds tolerance, leading users to steadily increase doses to achieve that same calming sedative effect. And then soon, this grows into a pattern where individuals rely on DPH as a daily escape, despite the mental and physical toll. The science behind DPH addiction lies in its impact on the brain's acetylcholine and dopamine receptors. Diphenhydramine acts as an anticholinergic, meaning it blocks acetyl. And then, as I already mentioned, diphenhydramine is an anticholinergic, meaning it blocks acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter responsible for memory, attention, and alertness. And then with prolonged or high-dose use, this blocking effect becomes more persistent, creating a state known as anticholinergic syndrome. In this state, individuals feel mentally sluggish, disconnected, and sometimes confused, even when they aren't under the drug's immediate influence. And then, the interesting thing is that over time, the brain's ability to produce and regulate acetylcholine becomes impaired, leading to lasting cognitive effects that makes quitting even harder. At the same time, DPH affects the dopamine pathways involved in motivation and reward. While DPH doesn't create a euphoric dopamine spike like other addictive substances, the sedation and detachment it provides can become psychologically reinforcing. For some users, this creates a reliance on the mental numbing effect of DPH, which offers a temporary escape from stress, anxiety, or emotional pain. The dopamine system subtly reinforces this behavior, nudging users to repeat the experience in search of that same mental distance, even though it doesn't offer the classic reward found in other drugs. One significant consequence of DPH addiction is its impact on cognitive functioning. Long-term users often experience issues with memory, attention, and mental clarity because of the drug's anticholinergic effects. Physically, DPH addiction strains the body in actually a lot of ways. Users often experience side effects like dry mouth, urinary retention, constipation, and an increased heart rate. And I can attest to this. Last night, I could not sleep. I had to go to sleep early, right? And I wasn't sleepy, so I took 2 Benadryl to go to sleep. And this whole time I've been recording this, right now it's noon, and I woke up like 2 hours ago, right? My mouth has been dry as hell. I think I drank like a fourth of a gallon of water, and then like 2 more like water bottles, like, you know, the standard like Walmart water bottles. And my mouth is still so dry. Anyways, these issues can become chronic, especially as tolerance builds, leading people to take larger doses that intensify the physical toll, and then over time, the drug also places strain on the kidneys and liver, as these organs work harder to filter and process large amounts of diphenhydramine. Unlike other drugs that may show obvious signs of damage, DPH addiction's effects are more gradual, creeping up until users find it difficult to break free from the physical and cognitive impacts. Psychological dependence on DPH is marked by a reliance on its numbing effects as a coping mechanism. Basically, people find that they crave that fog the DPH gives, and then also when you're trying to quit, you can experience what's known as a rebound insomnia, which I think I mentioned earlier, which is where you need it to fall asleep. During withdrawal, former users often feel restless and find themselves dealing with intense, vivid dreams or flashbacks of their DPH experiences. And it's kind of sad, these symptoms can last for up to weeks or even months, depending on how long the person was using and the doses that they were taking. Now, DPH addiction is a bad thing. DPH is a bad thing to get addicted to. Please don't take enough to get addicted to it. Be careful. And if you need help, I'll link the DPH help thing in my description, and also, communities like r/DPH Anonymous, etc. Please be safe. Next up, we got shadow people. Shadow people are one of the creepiest and most unsettling parts of a high-dose Benadryl trip. If you go deep enough into DPH territory, you'll probably come across these shadowy figures. Dark, human-like shapes that just stand there watching. As I mentioned earlier, these hallucinations are more intense than typical drug visuals. They don't just appear and disappear, they seem like they're actually aware of you, and that's what makes them so unsettling. Usually they hang around the edges of your vision, lurking in corners or standing just far enough away that you can't make out any features. Even though they don't have faces or expressions, the feeling that they're observing you is hard to shake. As you know, DPH messes with neurotransmitters, creating gaps in your perception that your brain then fills with these shadowy figures. Unlike other kinds of hallucinations, shadow people on Benadryl feel interactive and eerily lifelike. A lot of people try to stare them down, only for the figures to disappear or shift away, as if they're deliberately evading you. Sometimes they even seem to whisper or mutter, though it's almost impossible to catch what they're saying. These aren't just random shapes, they can feel like they have a presence, like they're there specifically to make you feel watched, which can easily spiral into paranoia. For people who have seen them, shadow people aren't just disturbing in the moment, they tend to leave a lasting impression. Even long after the trip ends, some people catch glimpses of them out in the corner of their eye, especially in dim lighting, like a flashback that refuses to go away. This lingering sense of something's there can stick around for days, weeks, or even longer, adding to that overall feeling of paranoia. It's one reason why so many users warn others about high-dose DPH trips. Shadow people might be imaginary, but the fear and anxiety that they leave behind feels all too real. Inside DPH forums and communities, shadow people have practically become a cautionary symbol. People who've experienced them often share their stories as a warning, telling newcomers that shadow people aren't fun hallucinations. They're creepy, often traumatic, and hard to forget. Many users describe shadow people as a sign that they've gone too far, a dark reminder of how DPH can pull you into a psychological nightmare that doesn't feel just like another drug trip. It feels like a place you're not supposed to be, where things watch you from the shadows and you're left wondering if they'll ever really go away. Next up, we got erectile dysfunction. Erectile dysfunction, ED, is an unfortunate but common side effect of long-term or high-dose DPH use. As I mentioned earlier, DPH interferes with neurotransmitters, which impacts a range of bodily functions, and ED is one of the more persistent issues. For people who use Benadryl recreationally or frequently, this side effect often creeps up over time, catching them off guard. DPH impacts the body's ability to maintain healthy blood flow and nerve function, two things essential for sexual performance. By blocking acetylcholine and affecting blood vessels, DPH can lead to a decrease in libido and physical responsiveness. This isn't just a temporary effect either. People who take DPH regularly often report that the issue sticks around even when they're not actively using the drug. The cumulative impact on blood flow and nerve sensitivity makes it harder for the body to bounce back after frequent use, creating a cycle that can be frustrating and difficult to manage. But yeah, that's about all I have to say about that one. Next up, we got trip reports. Trip reports are a huge part of the DPH community, especially in online forums where users share the details of their Benadryl experiences. If you're ever curious or just want a reason to avoid high doses, reading through these reports gives you a pretty good front row seat to the bizarre, unsettling, and often terrifying aspects of high-dose Benadryl. People post these stories to give others a real sense of what they went through, from hallucinations to paranoia and everything in between. These reports are like a mix of cautionary tales and mental snapshots of what it's like to deep dive into a DPH trip. One thing that pops up a lot in trip reports is just how unpredictable DPH can be. As you'll read, you'll notice common themes. Shadow people, which we've already talked about, the sensation of bugs crawling on the skin, which we're going to talk about, and intense paranoia. Users often describe their trips as dark or nightmarish, and there's also a sense of being trapped in a loop or of feeling stuck in their own mind, which can turn really scary really fast. These reports get into the gritty details, describing hallucinations that feel disturbingly real, and we've already talked about a lot of stuff that can happen on a trip. A lot of people post these stories not just to share their experiences, but to warn others. You'll see a lot of phrases like, "I'll never do this again," or "If you're thinking about trying this, don't." The community often views trip reports as cautionary tales, using them to keep newcomers informed about what they're getting into. Alright, that was the end of Layer 4. Let's get into Layer 5, starting with the spiders. One of the creepiest and most common hallucinations people report with high-dose Benadryl is seeing spiders. If you take enough DPH, there's a good chance you'll start seeing spiders crawling up walls, across your skin, or out of the corners of your vision. This isn't like a small, harmless vision either. People describe these spiders as feeling intensely real, often leaving them panicked, trying to brush them off or get away from them. In trip reports, users talk about how these spiders aren't just a quick glimpse either. They often seem to stick around and act as if they're genuinely there. For some, it starts with seeing one or two out of the corner of their eye, but as the dose kicks in, the spiders multiply, and suddenly they're everywhere, crawling up the walls, skittering across floors, and even on your body. People often describe feeling them on their skin, which is enough to make anyone start scratching or trying to brush them away. What makes it worse is that this feeling really isn't just a visual trick, As I mentioned earlier, DPH creates tactile hallucinations too, so the sensation of these spiders crawling on your arms or legs feels incredibly convincing. This is the kind of hallucination that doesn't just disturb you in the moment, it can leave like a trauma. Now, there isn't just one single clear reason why spiders are such a common theme with Benadryl, but some believe it has to do with how DPH messes with your sensory perception. As you know, DPH's impact on acetylcholine can cause confusion between what's real and imagined, making it easy for your brain to just fill in the blanks with something primal, like bugs or spiders, things that naturally trigger a fear response. These creatures are unsettling for most people to begin with, so seeing them as part of a drug-induced hallucination hits even harder. Which that makes me think, if it fills in the blank with something that will cause a fear trigger, do people with different phobias, see different scary things that's, tailored to what they're afraid of? I don't know if you know this about me, but I have a fear of whales and dolphins, so, if I trip on Benadryl, am I gonna see, just a bunch of whales everywhere, out my window? But anyways, the spiders are so common that it's almost expected in the DPH community. It's kind of like a shared nightmare that everyone who's gone too far has faced. So that's kind of scary. Next up, we have replications. Replications refers to a strange phenomenon people sometimes experience during high-dose Benadryl trips, where objects, people, or even parts of their surroundings appear to double or repeat in weird ways. You might look at something, your hand, a piece of furniture, or even a doorway, and see it replicate into 2, 3, or more versions of itself. This isn't just a quick glitch either. It can feel like these copies are genuinely there, as if your brain is tricking you into believing the environment around you is breaking apart or duplicating in real time. People who have gone through this describe it as disorienting, like their perception of reality is splitting. You might try to focus on one thing, only to see it multiply in a way that leaves you questioning what's real and what isn't. It's not the same as seeing double or blurred vision, it's more like seeing clones of objects or people scattered around, sometimes in perfect symmetry, and sometimes at random angles or placements that don't even make sense. In forums, users describe feeling like their surroundings have turned into some kind of twisted mirror world, where everything has an extra, unnecessary, quote, copy. And then I have to mention this, like as you know from earlier entries, DPH messes with your sensory processing, making you prone to confusing real and imagined things. And then with replications, your brain is trying to make sense of what's around you, but it ends up over-processing, adding extra images of things that aren't actually there. Replications are often mentioned in DPH trip reports, where people warn about how disorienting and unsettling the replications can be, and some users describe rooms that seem to stretch on endlessly with duplicated furniture, kind of like a mirror hallway, you know? Or they might look in the mirror and see multiple versions of themselves staring back. Others talk about seeing shadow people or spiders replicate as well, which only adds to the paranoia. I can't imagine how awful that must be. In the DPH community, replications are seen as one of the stranger, almost glitchy effects that sets Benadryl apart from other drugs. People who have experienced it tend to share their stories as a heads up to anyone who's curious, pointing out that these replications feel confusing and disturbing, and then for a lot of users, seeing the world double up around them marks the point where this trip becomes too much. Which, I mean. Next up we have you/tired of people faking too. This one's sad. The story of you/tired of people faking too is one of the most talked about cautionary tales in the DPH community. This user documented nearly 3 years of addiction to high doses of Benadryl, describing the mental and physical toll it took on their life. Their posts have been collected in a Reddit summary, which is a post by you/given to the wind, and I'll link that down there if you want to read the whole thing, because I'm not going to read all of you/tired of people faking's posts, but I will explain it. You/tired people faking too started experimenting with DPH after coming across it as a legal, accessible alternative to other hallucinogens. In early 2019, they took their first dose of 450 milligrams while drinking, just to, quote, see what would happen. Despite describing the experience as, quote, horrible, they kept taking it. And soon they were dosing more frequently, and the amounts climbed higher and higher. Before long, they were taking 1,500 milligrams or more in one go, amounts that most people would consider life-threatening. In one post, they even mentioned 9,000 milligrams, and while they knew it was dangerous, they admitted they, quote, didn't care enough to stop. This cycle of tolerance and dependency quickly became their new reality. Now I have to mention that there is a lot of discussion that people think that this user is fake, and it definitely could be. I think that the 9,000 milligram thing, is a bit of an exaggeration, but it could be real too, and they could have just been exaggerating about how much they were gonna take. So I'm not here to say, I don't know. It could be real, it could be fake, but either way, it's heartbreaking, and I'm gonna continue on. So over time, their body and mind started to show the serious effects of constant high-dose DPH use. They wrote about memory loss, cognitive fog, and confusion, all of which became so bad they could barely focus or remember basic things. Physically, their heart and lungs began to give out. They described being rushed to the ICU multiple times due to seizures, irregular heartbeats, and even respiratory failure. In one post, they said DPH left them in a coma with a breathing tube, only to come out of it and go back to the drug. The mental toll was just as intense. They often mentioned feeling angry, hopeless, and numb. In a particularly raw post, they talked about how they didn't care if they lived or died, and they were taking DPH to escape reality. The drug had such a grip on them that they didn't want to feel sober anymore because it meant facing everything that they'd lost because of the DPH. They said that DPH addiction ruined their ability to study, work, and even keep relationships with friends and family, isolating them from everyone who cared. Despite their addiction, they shared countless warnings with others. In several posts, they urged anyone curious about DPH to avoid it altogether, calling it a, quote, endless black hole of terror, pain, and confusion. They explained how DPH wasn't just a fun trip, but something that pulled them into hallucinations and paranoia that they couldn't control. By describing their own experience so openly, they tried to dissuade others from going down the same path. They posted trip reports dealing terrifying hallucinations like shadow people, spiders, and nightmarish visions that would feel real. They talked about seeing things that followed them around or made them feel like they were being hunted. These reports weren't just for shock either, they were there to show people the mental horror of high-dose Benadryl. And for anyone reading, it was clear that their life had turned into a loop of fear and confusion, all because of a drug that people think is harmless. In their last posts, it became clear that the addiction was taking everything from them. They shared how they were taking upwards of 100 pills in a single dose, and they couldn't go more than 2 days without it. Despite wanting to quit, they felt trapped, explaining that they hated DPH. In one of their last posts, they mentioned planning a massive dose of 276 pills, and tragically, it appears that this was the last post they ever made. I hope they're still alive out there, and I hope it was fake, but God, that's sad. Next on the iceberg is heavy recreational use. Heavy recreational use of Benadryl or DPH involves taking doses beyond typical recreational levels, usually starting at around 500 milligrams and often going into the thousands. This level of use is where the effects shift from mild hallucinations and drowsiness into full-blown delirium, terrifying hallucinations, and physical and mental health risks. Heavy users typically find themselves in a cycle where they need increasingly high doses, At these levels, the familiar hallucinations of shadow people, spiders, and even replications can intensify, turning the trip into a full mental maze. Unlike lighter experiences, heavy doses blur the lines between reality and hallucinations to a point where users can't tell what's real. There's often a sense of being stuck in loops where users repeat actions or try to focus on a thought, only to lose it moments later. These trips turn into nightmarish cycles where paranoia, confusion, and hallucinations converge to create an awful experience. And as I touched on earlier, the physical risks escalate at this level too. High doses of DPH can cause severe cardiovascular strain, from rapid and irregular heartbeats to dangerous like conditions. Respiratory depression, a slower or labored breath, is also a real risk, especially when DPH is mixed with other depressants. Next up we have 700 Club. In DPH circles, the 700 Club is a notorious term for those who have taken 700 milligrams of Benadryl or more in one sitting. At this dose, you're well past any light recreational use and stepping deep into the heaviest, most intense effects DPH can produce. As you probably guessed from everything we've talked about before, 700 milligrams isn't just a casual experiment. People in the 700 Club are experiencing full-blown hallucinations, delusions, and a mental trip that feels more like a nightmare than anything desirable. Once you hit 700 milligrams, you're way beyond the initial side effects like drowsiness or mild confusion. As I mentioned before, this level of DPH can make you see shadow people, spiders, and replications, but at 700 milligrams, these hallucinations become disturbingly lifelike. People in the 700 Club often report seeing figures in vivid detail, having conversations with people who aren't there, or feeling like they're in a strange alternate version of their surroundings. Reality gets, absolutely twisted. And it's not just the visuals either. At 700 milligrams, the mental loops we've talked about become even more intense. People report getting stuck in repetitive thought patterns, having conversations that loop endlessly, or trying to accomplish a task only to forget what they're doing every few seconds. It's a complete disconnection from reality that can make users feel trapped, which is why so many people who have been there say it's not worth it. And the physical toll at 700 milligrams is no joke either. As we've covered in heavy recreational use, DPH at this level strains your heart, making it race or beat irregularly, which can be dangerous if you're already pushing high doses. Respiratory issues, severe dry mouth, and dehydration also become a problem at this point. People who've gone through it warn that even after the trip ends, they're left with a pounding heart, shakiness, and sometimes lingering paranoia, especially as the hallucinations start fading away. Next up we got r/I love DPH. r/I love DPH is another community in the DPH world, but this one's more extreme. Unlike harm reduction spaces like r/DPH Anonymous, where people try to quit or manage their use, r/I love DPH often leans into the heaviest, most mind-bending experiences DPH has to offer. Users share intense trip reports, tips for handling high doses, and personal reflections that might make you wonder why anyone would want to go down that path in the first place. The tone of r/I love DPH can feel intense and unapologetically pro-DPH. While most people understand the risks, there is an attitude in this community that embraces DPH's delirium and strange hallucinations. People in this subreddit often refer to DPH as a trip worth exploring, even though it's far from a typical recreational drug. And there's also like a level of self-awareness where like a lot of people are just joking about the absurdity or the darkness of their experiences. And then you'll find a lot of like super detailed trip reports in r/ILoveDPH, which I might make a video on reading some of those. But yeah, that's about it for that one. Yeah. Next up we have F.A. Costello. F.A. Costello is just the owner and like admin of r/ILoveDPH. I think that's all there really is to it. Alright, next up we have 4,000 milligram trip, which I feel like from my research is some kind of specific trip out there. I don't know if I found it. I found this one, which only has 18 upvotes on Reddit, but I'll read this just so you can understand what a 4,000 milligram trip is actually like. But I feel like I'm missing something because there are a lot of references to it online, but I couldn't find it, but I'll read this one. It's kind of short, but it's pretty interesting and actually really, really fucking sad. This is from u/Johnny R3BL. So I was feeling suicidal and decided to get a few boxes of Benadryl and took them all late at night, which ended up being 168 pills, but I couldn't get the last 8 down, lol, so I had 160, which is 4,000 milligrams of DPH. I've had 96 before, but that didn't do the trick. I'm a big guy. So it was about 12 a.m. and I ate them all, and not 5 minutes later I was already stumbling and dizzy, and my vision was getting fuzzy. I went into my bedroom about 5 minutes later and was feeling sick to my stomach. I tried throwing up because I'm a pussy, but nothing would come out. When I was in the bathroom, I was seeing hundreds of baby spiders in the sink and on the bathroom floor and toilet, but I didn't really care because I'm not scared of spiders, or maybe I was just too messed up to give a shit. Every time I flushed the toilet or closed a door, it sounded like a nuclear bomb was going off and rang in my ears. So I went to my bedroom after giving up and just laid in my bed for what felt like hours with not much happening. But it felt like my heart was in my eyes, and when I looked in the mirror, my eyes were wide open, even though they felt like they were normally open. And there looked like there was brown spots in my eyes, like an old, alcoholic, homeless man. I laid in my bed and put on Sanford & Son on the TV to relax, but I couldn't hear the audio from the TV even though it was on. Every while, I would hear random music like it was coming from an old 1950s radio or some shit, even though there was nothing playing. As if aliens were trying to communicate with my brain or something, but it freaked me out bad. I thought I saw my cat laying in my bed, but when I went to touch it, my hand went straight through. Not much else happened that night from what I remember, so I just went to sleep with the TV on, scared to be in total dark. Somehow I was able to sleep, although I was more paranoid than a French whore in church. I woke up in the morning, sadly, covered in my own vomit and feeling like my head was mush. I wasn't laying on my back when I fell asleep, so I didn't end up suffocating on my own throw up. Everything was in a deep yellow tint, like I had a Mexico filter on, and whenever I saw my parents or myself in the mirror, it looked like we were Simpsons. I was still worn out and tired as hell, and my legs felt like I ran a marathon, all noodle-like, and every time my mom saw me, she said I looked funny. I can only imagine what she was seeing, a guy looking like my eyes were about to pop out my head. She cleaned my sheets and told me to take my shirt off to wash it, but it took me 20 minutes to figure out what I had to do, so she had to take the shirt off me and find me a clean one because my dumbass couldn't see the clean shirts right in front of me, lol. Every conversation I had felt like I was in a Telltale game, even though I usually only say a word or two. I went downstairs once and it felt like the stairs were 2 feet lower than they should be. Somehow, I didn't bust my ass, but it took me about 2 minutes to get down the 15 stairs, same going up. I laid in my bed most of the day because I didn't know what else to do, as I was exhausted and probably ended up sleeping about 15 hours. When I wasn't sleeping, I was watching YouTube on my TV and hiding my painted fingernails from my dad under a book I pretended to read. I slept, woke up again at like 3 a.m., took off my nail polish, and watched Sanford & Son for a few hours and slept. All while my vision was fuzzy as hell, by the way. Anyways, I ended up living and felt like shit for 3 days, still feeling weak and seeing in a hello yellow tint. Now, every time I see a Benadryl pill or packaging, I feel sick to my stomach. And I just want to say, this subreddit is from r/trip report, so it's not from any of the DPH subreddits, but the comments are so supportive on this one. I just had to point that out. Like, this story is so sad. People are saying, like, he shouldn't give up on life. He should paint his nails if he wants to and not have to hide it from his parents. And yeah, if you're watching this, Johnny R3BL, or if anybody out there feels the same way as this guy, please don't try to die. People love you. People care about you. People can care about you. There's so much to live for, and these feelings, they suck, but don't die. And I promise I'm not trying to shill, but, you know, if you want to hit me up on Instagram or join my Discord server and try to talk to me, I'm sure people in my Discord server will be there to talk to you. We have a venting channel, and I'll reply to any Instagram DMs I get from people who need to talk. Like, please, seriously, talk to me. Don't do anything bad. Anyways, let's get on with this goofy Benadryl Iceberg. Next up, we got Staz Constantine. Staz Constantine is a Reddit user who was pretty popular, and he was popular because he made a lot of these like DPH, dissociative open eye visual replication videos on YouTube, which were supposed to replicate what it would be like to be on DPH. And I'll play one of those videos now. They're actually really interesting and they're really well made. But sadly, it seems like the overall like consensus on the internet and what people think, I'm not sure if it's confirmed. I've looked at it a little bit. I've researched this. I'm not sure if it's confirmed, but people seem to think that this guy did not make it past one of his DPH trips, if you know what I mean, which is so sad. Like, this drug, guys, please don't do like over, you know, like don't fucking kill yourself with this drug, please. Be careful, don't do this in an unhealthy way. But yeah, Staz Constantine, rest in peace, seriously. But yeah, he made cool animations and videos. Really good ones, really well made. Next up, we have HPPD. HPPD stands for Hallucinogen Persisting Perception Disorder, and it's a condition where people continue experiencing hallucinations or visual distortions long after a drug has left their system. For DPH users, especially those who have ventured into heavy or frequent use, HPPD can be a lingering and sometimes frightening side effect. Even though HPPD is more commonly associated with classic psychedelics like LSD, DPH's high dose and anticholinergic effects can leave users with similar lasting symptoms. People with HPPD report seeing things like trails following moving objects, static or visual snow over their field of vision, and strange flashes of light. For former DPH users, HPPD might mean catching glimpses of shadow people in the corner of their vision, sudden movements that aren't there, or the feeling that walls or objects are suddenly shifting. And then, as I mentioned in the shadow people entry, these kinds of lasting visual disturbances can become unsettling, making people feel like the hallucinations that they experience on DPH are still there. For people who develop HPPD after using DPH, the experience can be frustrating and sometimes frightening. The unexpected flashes, movements, or shapes can lead to paranoia or anxiety, especially if users are seeing residual shadow people or spiders. While not everyone experiences it, those who do often talk about how hard it is to shake the sense that something is off about their perception. Some users describe it as feeling haunted by the remnants of their trips. In online DPH forums, people share tips for managing HPPD symptoms, often suggesting things like reducing stress, avoiding substances that could trigger more visuals, and grounding exercises to help cope with visual distortions. For those who have had HPPD linger from DPH use, it serves as a constant reminder of the drug's effects, which should be and often is enough to dissuade them from ever using again in that way. Next up, we have Starbrother. Starbrother is another member of the community online for DPH, and he's best known for basically, I don't want to say inventing the Hat Man, because it's been around forever, but he kind of introduced the Hat Man into DPH, like, lore, I guess, like online for the first time. And he did this through a story he wrote from the perspective of a Hat Man, which is pretty interesting, where the story's about him like the Hat Man kind of going to multiple people and like how he interacts with them is kind of interesting. I'm not going to read the whole thing. If you want to read it, I'll try to link it down in the description. But yeah, it's pretty cool. And then fittingly, next up we have the Hat Man. One of the strangest and most notorious figures that high-dose DPH users encounter is the Hat Man. If you're deep enough into a DPH trip, you might see him, a tall, shadowy figure wearing a wide-brimmed hat. Unlike the more generic shadow people, the Hat Man stands out. People describe him as more vivid, more ominous, and sometimes even interactive. He doesn't just lurk around, he feels like he's watching you, like he has a presence that's both unsettling and magnetic. For most people, seeing the Hat Man isn't a casual, oh that's weird, kind of moment. It's terrifying. Imagine being deep into a DPH haze, already struggling to tell what's real, and then noticing this tall, shadowy figure just standing there, staring. Users say he doesn't move much. He usually just stands at a distance, his silhouette clear and dark, with that wide-brimmed hat as his defining feature. And even though he doesn't say or do anything, his presence feels heavy, like he's there with some kind of purpose. Some users try to approach him, but he usually fades away or moves just out of reach, making the whole experience feel like a twisted game of cat and mouse. Others describe feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, like they're being watched or judged. It's not uncommon for people to freeze up, afraid to even blink, convinced that if they take their eyes off him, he might come closer. In the DPH community, the Hat Man has become almost a legend, with people sharing theories about what he means. Some think he's just a product of DPH messing with the brain, creating a unique and repeatable hallucination that's fueled by paranoia and darkness. And others say he's a manifestation of the drug's effects on your mental state, kind of a trip guardian who represents the more sinister side of DPH. Since he appears at very high doses, there's this unspoken idea that if you see the Hat Man, you're in deep, too deep. Alright, next up on the iceberg we have Ariel? Something like that. In the DPH community, Ariel is a term used to describe the extreme threshold or breakthrough level of deliriant use, similar to how psychedelics have hyperspace or dissociatives have holes. This level usually occurs around doses between 1.2 grams and 2 grams, a range so high that it carries serious risks of death, seizures, and permanent psychological trauma. People who reach Ariel aren't just tripping, they're fully disconnected from reality, often walking around talking to hallucinations and interacting with people or scenes that don't exist. In Ariel, the hallucinations reach a level of intensity that makes them impossible to distinguish from reality. Instead of a few isolated shadow people watching from a distance, there are often many, and they're moving around, interacting with each other, creating a surreal, bustling environment that can feel like a chaotic dream. One user compared it to the Star Wars cantina scene, full of figures completely ignoring the user, unlike typical DPH hallucinations where shadow people watch or follow. Even at this extreme level, the Hat Man often remains, watching quietly. The consistency of his presence is a hallmark of Ariel, anchoring the experience in the familiar darkness of DPH hallucinations, even as everything else descends into chaotic and somehow hellish scenes. After reaching Ariel, one person describes seeing horrifying scenes like loved ones and friends crucified on their front lawn, vivid images that can lead to lasting trauma, including PTSD. So yeah, not very fun, but basically Ariel is like the Benadryl equivalent of like a K-hole for ketamine, pretty much. That user said that this level is objectively terrible for your mental and physical health, that seizures are common. The user said that they have a few memories of the trip, one of them being in a cave, throwing a torch at a cave demon, and then realizing that he was in his hallway and he had thrown his phone at his dog. And then he said he had another memory of feeling like being chased by something with teeth. And then again, like I said earlier, the most horrific one was seeing his entire family, as well as most of his friends and coworkers, crucified and bleeding on his front lawn and screaming at him to like mad that he did that to them. Like why'd you do that to me? Next up, we have r/DPH Lovers Secret Club. This subreddit is, as far as I can tell, deleted now, but from what I researched, it was a private subreddit for people who were really into DPH, I guess, and had like private access to it. But it's deleted now, and even if it wasn't deleted, I still would have no way of accessing it. But yeah, we can only speculate as to what was on there, but if you or someone you know has access to that or had access to that, please let me know in the comments and let me know. I think it'd be awesome to learn more about that, but moving on. Okay, next up on the iceberg is 420chan/Dell and Cedric Lightberry, and I'm gonna kind of pair these together. So Cedric Lightberry was one of 420chan/Dell's biggest members, right? Or most famous, well-known members. So what 420chan/Dell was is 420chan was an old message forum type thing on the internet that's not there anymore. And the /Dell subsection of the website was for deliriants, aka for things like Benadryl. And then Cedric Lightberry was one of the members who posted on there and posted a lot of his trip reports. First of all, I just want to say it's kind of cool looking at old, websites like this. It's just nostalgic and interesting. And the only trip reports I could find from that specific place on the website is Cedric Lightberry's trip reports. So I'm just going to read his and just cover both these entries in one go because this video is already getting kind of long and we're not even in the last layer yet. Okay. Cedric Lightberry, 1800 milligram DPH. Down to 1800 milligrams DPH a few minutes ago. Before you ask, I am not trying to be a hero, but I do wish to get as close to death as possible. Doors are locked, phone is off, wish me luck. Let's see how this goes, shall we? Other poster, suicide or just having tea with death? Cedric. T with death is what I'm aiming for. Typing this took me way longer than it should have. Not if I'll be able to post later on. Trip report will be here. If I stay alive, that is. Holy fucking fuck. I'm alive. I've never appreciated that fact more than I do now. Fuck. Still having some visual distortions. Am feeling sick, but mostly down now. Before I started the trip report, I should warn you kids to not do this much DPH, no matter what. I did it. I've seen it. You don't have to follow my stupidity. You don't want to go there. Trust me. So about 30 minutes after taking the pills, I started feeling heavy. The feeling was getting increasingly stronger. I tried my best to keep my mind blank, but failed and started freaking out after gaining approximately 400 pounds and having my ears ring so badly I couldn't hear anything else, including my own voice when I started talking. Then, for a short moment, my vision went black and white, and then I flashed back to normal again. After this, the ringing began to go away, and after it was done, the visuals kicked in. Hardcore. First thing I remember, my ceiling, walls, and floor were melting and I was being pulled down by an enormous force. However, moving wasn't too difficult after a bit of trying. Every shadow in my room was crawling with insects. Apart from a big juicy taco right above my head, there was a cluster of centipedes on the floor, and some of them were running around the table. They wouldn't go away when touched. The longer I stared, the more of them would appear, until I wasn't in my room anymore. Everything around me was a moving, living mass. I don't remember what else happened at this stage, or how did I escape it, but after it went away, some inanimate objects appeared to be breathing, and I was afraid to touch them. Examples, keys of the keyboard. I had an extremely dry mouth, so I got up and went to get myself a glass of water. It didn't help much, but I drank a lot anyway. After finishing the third glass, I heard music coming from the other room, so I went to check it out. First thing I noticed, there was a human-sized creature standing in the corner. I assume it was a doll. It would lose its parts, arms, legs, head, from time to time, but as soon as it looked away and looked back again, it was whole again. I was afraid to touch it because I was sure it would hurt me. The doll stayed in that corner, dissembling and reassembling itself again and again during this whole stage of the trip. Second thing I noticed, there was a man dressed in black, his head buried in shadows, sitting on the sofa, and several other people/creatures wandering around, then fading later. Not all of them went away though. Some shadow figures got more human-like in time, and I had some conversations with who I thought were my friends. Everything was incredibly realistic. I could touch, hear, and smell them, but after a while, most of them went away. But the dark man on the sofa stayed where he was, so I went up to him and sat down as well. I couldn't see his face, but didn't pay much attention then. I believe this, my friends, was the Hat Man himself. All the interaction we had was a handshake and a bit of talking. I said hi to him, and he said hello Cedric back. Then I asked if I was going to die. He was quiet for a while, then said, "Don't go to Ariel." After those words, there was a sudden flash of light, and I found myself standing in the kitchen with a broken glass on the floor. I went to check the room I was meant to be at. Nothing was there. Suddenly, I felt that the message I got was very important and I had to tell others, so I went back to the room, to my computer, and tried to post the phrase on this thread, only to find out that I was standing on the other side of the room, facing the wall, later. Then I would go back to the computer and repeat what I did, but it would always end the same. I was stuck in a loop. This was extremely terrifying. I think nothing during this trip scared me as much as the thought of being stuck in that loop forever. After I repeated this about 6 times, I sent, "Am I actually typing this?" which surprisingly got through. I was extremely relieved. Then another flash followed, and I would hear people knocking at my door. I would go and let them in. We talked, then one of the guests turned out to be my father, which is dead. I repeat, everything I saw and heard was extremely realistic, and I took it as reality. I was paralyzed by horror for a moment when I realized I was dead. It was so clear now. I took too much DPH, too much to come back from where it took me. I asked my father if I was dead. He said no, then I asked how I can be here with him, and he answered, "If you can be, you are not dead." We mostly just sat together quietly ignoring the others. They were going on with their own conversations, when a young dark-haired man came up to me and offered me a cigarette. I took it and smoked for a bit. It would always become a new, freshly lit one after taking my attention off it for a while. Suddenly, the room went silent. I looked around to see what was up. Everyone was gone. My room window was covered with moths now. I figured the people in my room were those moths from the very beginning. After yet another flash, I was laying on the floor, with the Sahara Desert for a mouth and a mild headache. I managed to go and lay down on the bed. There are many blackouts from this point. Basically, all I can remember are whispers saying, "Don't go to Ariel," repeating from time to time. I realized I was the one saying that. Tacos crawling on my sheets and visual distortions of the room. My thoughts wouldn't stop bothering me. I thought I could hear screaming. I felt heavy and sick. I probably fell asleep at some point, but I have no clue what I did before Neath because there are just way too many gaps and no one to tell the story from a different angle. So yeah, that is one of Cedric Lightberry's posts from 420chan's /Dell section. Pretty scary. Next up, we have spiritual beliefs about DPH. In certain corners of the DPH and delirium communities, people have shared various spiritual or metaphysical interpretations of their experiences. While DPH is generally seen as a recreational drug, or more often, a cautionary tale due to its dangerous side effects, some users have found spiritual meaning or insight during their high-dose trips. These interpretations are usually deeply personal, as DPH doesn't have the same established spiritual or cultural use as psychedelics like mushrooms or other stuff. However, for some, the intensity of the hallucinations and the sense of breaking through into another reality can create feelings of spiritual significance. One of the most commonly shared spiritual interpretations revolves around the Shadow People and the Hat Man, figures that often appear during these trips. Some users interpret these figures as entities from another dimension or plane of existence, beings that are somehow aware of the user's presence and watching them from beyond the veil of reality. In this interpretation, the Shadow People are more than just hallucinations. They are thought to be spiritual or otherworldly beings that become visible when the mind is altered by DPH's powerful effects. The Hat Man, in particular, has gained a kind of mythic status in these interpretations. Instead of being just a terrifying hallucination, some people believe he represents a guardian or even a reaper-like figure, overseeing those who come too close to the edge of life and death during a trip. Others believe the Hat Man symbolizes fear, guilt, or unresolved personal issues, manifesting during trips to confront the user on a spiritual level. As I've talked about earlier, reaching Ariel is like breaking through to a different level of reality on DPH. Some users interpret this level as a spiritual realm, a place where their consciousness is no longer tethered to the physical world. For those who find meaning in this state, Ariel might represent an opportunity to face personal demons, unlock hidden truths about themselves, or experience something they feel is closer to death or the afterlife. However, many people caution against seeing this experience in a purely spiritual light, as the hallucinations and delusions are often overwhelming, confusing, and disturbing. Unlike traditional spiritual practices with psychedelics, DPH's effects don't typically lead to insights or euphoria. Rather, the spiritual interpretation comes from the sheer intensity of the trip and the feeling that reality has fundamentally shifted. Given the dark and often horrifying nature of high-dose DPH trips, it's no surprise that some users associate the experience with death or the afterlife. The feeling of being watched by shadow people, along with the disconnection from reality, often leads people to feel like they're hovering between life and death. The state can evoke spiritual reflections on mortality, the soul, and what lies beyond physical existence. Some users feel as though they've caught a glimpse of what death might be like, particularly when encountering vivid hallucinations of their own death or violent imagery involving themselves or loved ones. For some users, DPH trips spark personal spiritual reflections, even if those reflections come through unsettling or terrifying experiences. After a particularly intense trip, some users describe feeling a renewed appreciation for life, or a sense of having faced their deepest fears. Others, however, come out of the experience feeling emotionally or spiritually scarred, especially if they encounter traumatic hallucinations. So yeah, that I should just say with that I still don't advocate it. It's not a good idea. Be careful. Next up on the iceberg is overdose trip reports. Now, I'm assuming by overdose it means like near fatality. So yeah, this is just another reminder that Benadryl can be dangerous if you take too much. Obviously, people do use it recreationally, but even those people, most of them will admit that when they were using DPH a lot, it was during a bad part in their life and they regret it, and it was when they were mentally ill. So any use other than what's in the bottle probably isn't the best idea. And then anything that can bring you to near fatality, just please be careful. I already read the story of that one guy who probably died from DPH. It's really scary, guys. Just please be careful. And that's the end of layer 6. One layer left, guys. This one is scary. Let's get into it. Starting with permanent brain damage. One of the scariest risks that comes with heavy and repeated DPH use is the potential for permanent brain damage. This isn't just about temporary side effects like confusion or memory loss during a trip. It's the lasting impact that sticks with you long after the drug leaves your system. People who regularly take high doses of DPH, especially those in the range of 1 gram or more, often report long-term cognitive issues that can affect their ability to function normally in day-to-day life. As we've touched on earlier, DPH works by blocking acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter that plays a big role in memory, attention, and overall brain function. In high doses, this disruption can cause confusion, memory lapses, and the brain fog that many DPH users talk about. But what's more concerning is that over time, this interference with brain chemistry can lead to long-term damage. Users often describe feeling mentally slowed down with persistent memory problems and trouble focusing, even when they're no longer using the drug. In the worst cases, people who've abused DPH for extended periods report that they've permanently lost certain cognitive abilities. This includes issues with short-term memory, like forgetting what you were just doing, difficulty processing new information, and just a general sense that their brain just isn't working the way it used to. For many, these symptoms don't fade with time, suggesting that DPH may cause irreversible damage to the brain's neurotransmitter systems or even physical damage to brain cells directly. Some users in DPH communities share stories of feeling like they've, quote, fried their brains after repeated doses. They talk about struggling to complete tasks that used to be easy, like reading, concentrating at work, or holding conversations. The brain fog becomes constant, making it hard to focus or remember things. As I mentioned earlier, this isn't just something that happens while you're tripping. People experience these effects weeks, months, and even sometimes years after stopping DPH use. The long-term cognitive decline is one of the biggest risks of abusing DPH. What starts as a strange, hallucinogenic experience can end up leaving you with permanent damage that affects your ability to live a normal life. Some users compare it to having an early onset of dementia, feeling like their mind is slipping away even though they're still young. So yeah, hell yeah, be careful, and as I mentioned before, the higher you go into the aerial range, 1 gram and beyond, the more likely you are to cause lasting damage to your brain. Next up we have schizophrenia. One of the more serious risks tied to heavy and prolonged use of DPH is its potential to trigger schizophrenia-like symptoms, or even contribute to the onset of schizophrenia in vulnerable individuals. While DPH doesn't directly cause schizophrenia, there's concern in the community about how high doses of deliriants like DPH can push users into a mental state that mimics many of the key symptoms of schizophrenia, including things like hallucinations, paranoia, and delusions. For someone who may already be predisposed to mental illness, especially schizophrenia, the drug can act as a scary trigger. As we discussed before, DPH is often characterized by vivid and unsettling hallucinations like seeing shadow people or the Hat Man, but the hallucinations aren't limited to just visuals. People at high doses of DPH experience auditory hallucinations too, hearing voices, footsteps, or even having full-blown conversations with people that aren't there. These symptoms are eerily similar to those experienced by individuals with schizophrenia, where auditory and visual hallucinations are a key part of the disorder. What makes this connection even more alarming is the sense of paranoia and delusion that can come with both schizophrenia and high-dose DPH use. People on DPH often describe feeling like they're being watched, followed, or judged by their hallucinations, much like someone experiencing a psychotic break. The paranoia becomes so intense at times that it leaves users feeling isolated and anxious, unsure of what's real and what's imagined, and as you can imagine, this kind of experience can take a heavy toll on someone's mental health. For some individuals, particularly those with a family history of schizophrenia or a genetic predisposition to the disorder, using DPH can be a trigger, at least at high doses, While DPH doesn't cause schizophrenia by itself, the drug's powerful effects on the brain's neurotransmitters can push a vulnerable individual into an early onset of schizophrenia. In the same way that high levels of stress or drug use can trigger psychotic episodes, DPH's heavy interference with the brain's chemical balance may initiate or worsen schizophrenia symptoms. It's also important to know that people who already are diagnosed with schizophrenia or other mental health disorders are at an even higher risk. DPH can exacerbate their symptoms, making delusions, hallucinations, and paranoia far worse. Next up we have permatrip. A permatrip is a term that comes up in drug communities, and it refers to the unsettling experience where users feel like they are permanently stuck in a drug-altered state, even after the substance has worn off. For DPH users, a permatrip can feel like they never fully return to baseline after a particularly heavy or frequent use of the drug. For those who believe they are experiencing a permatrip from DPH, it often feels like the hallucinations and mental disorders they had during the trip haven't completely gone away. Shadow people, static in vision, similar to visual snow, strange flashes, and moments of confusion or paranoia can persist after the drug is already out of the system. And we already kind of talked about this a little bit, but yes, so as you've seen in earlier entries, DPH can wreak havoc on the brain's neurotransmitter system, particularly for blocking acetylcholine, but high doses of DPH can push your brain into a deeply altered state, and for some users, the brain struggles to fully recover. This leads to the feeling of being stuck in a perma-trip, where the brain's ability to process sensory information and maintain cognitive clarity never fully returns to normal. And I'm gonna leave it at that because basically we've already talked about perma-trip with like permanent brain damage and stuff. And next up we have dementia. One of the most severe long-term risks associated with frequent and heavy DPH use is the potential development of dementia-like symptoms. While DPH doesn't directly cause dementia in the same way as diseases like Alzheimer's, its effects on the brain can lead to cognitive decline that mimics the symptoms of dementia, especially in cases of prolonged or high-dose use. People who abuse DPH may experience memory loss, confusion, difficulty concentrating, and overall cognitive decline that can persist long after the drug use has stopped. Over time, especially with repeated abuse of the drug, the effect of how it messes with acetylcholine can become more permanent, which we've already kind of talked about. I'm just gonna leave it at that because it's like we've already mentioned how it can cause like memory loss and shit like later on in your life. But yeah, that's the end of the iceberg. I hope you guys enjoyed. Don't go yet. I just want to say thank you so much for watching. If you made it this far, please let me know in the comments. It means so much. I love you guys. Yeah, have a great night. Sweet dreams.